Charles Duhigg, welcome to the next big idea.
Thanks for having me. This is a real treat.
Charles, you taught us about the science of habit formation with the power of habit. You taught us how to be smarter, faster, and better. Now you're teaching us with your latest book, Supercommunicators, how to connect. Have you been solving your own problems with each of these
Yeah,
books?
no, absolutely. Absolutely. I'd say each of my books kind of starts with me being frustrated about something that I can't figure out on my own and needing an excuse to call experts and ask them. And in this particular case, two things happened. First of all, I wrote The Power of Habit, and I started getting a lot of emails from people who said, thank you for the book, and I took some of the ideas in it, and I managed to change my own behaviors, but there's this other person, and I don't know how to force them to change. Like they're the impediment to my success. And so what should I do about that? And then I fell into this pattern with my wife that seemed kind of similar to me to what these folks were asking, which is, my wife and I, we've been married for 20 years and a very happy marriage. But sometimes I would come home and be complaining about my day, and my boss doesn't appreciate me, and my coworkers aren't working as hard as I am, something like that. And my wife very practically would suggest a solution. She would say something like, "Why don't you take your boss out to lunch, and you guys can get to know each other a little bit better?" And instead of being able to hear what she was telling me, I would get even more upset, right? And I would say, like, "Why aren't you supporting me? You should be outraged on my behalf." And she would get upset because I was attacking her for giving me good advice. And so I went to all these researchers and I said, "What's going on here? Like, why does this pattern keep emerging even if I don't want it to?" And what they said was, "Well, it's interesting you ask, because we're living through this golden age of understanding communication because of advances
Mhm.
in neural
Yeah,
imaging and data
yeah.
collection. We understand how conversations work. And what we've learned is that you have to have the same kind of conversation at the same moment. And when you come home, you're having an emotional conversation and your wife is having a practical conversation. And if you're not having the same kind of conversation, at least at that moment, it's unlikely you're going to be able to connect with each other or even hear each other."
Well, I'll tell you, for those of us who are married and those of us who are not married, it is wonderful that we're having this renaissance of this explosion of discovery about how humans connect, and
Yeah.
I love this. I love this revelation that I think so many of us think of connection as some kind of miracle or gift that certain people have, but you've concluded that it's a skill.
Oh, it's absolutely. I mean, and it's just a series of skills. And it's helpful to talk about what happens in our heads when we communicate, because I think it sort of illustrates that. So when you're in a conversation, like the conversation we're having right now, even though we're separated by thousands of miles,
Yeah.
if we could measure it, what we would find is that our pupils are starting to dilate at the same rate. Our breath patterns, even though we're not in the same room, are starting to match each other. But most importantly, the activity within our brains, our neural activity, is starting to become more and more alike. And that makes a lot of sense when you think about it, because one of the things that makes communication so special, and that makes Homo sapiens be able to use it so well, is that if I describe an idea to you, or if I describe an emotion, you feel that same emotion at least a little bit, or you experience that same idea. And so it would make sense that our brains would become more and more aligned, or in the words of neurology, what's known as neurally entrained. And so
Yes, I love that. Yeah.
the goal of communication is to achieve this entrainment, right? To get our
Yeah.
brains to look similar. And what we know is that the way that our brains have evolved, because throughout history, communication has always been Homo sapiens' superpower, right? Communication is the thing that allowed our species to succeed so wildly compared to other species on this earth. Throughout history, or our brains have evolved so that when we do become neurally entrained, we feel connected to each other and it feels wonderful,
Yeah.
right? It's that feeling you
Yes.
get after a
Yeah.
great conversation.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Exactly. And we can get there better, as you pointed out in the anecdote about your wife. By the way, it's hard for me to imagine, Charles, that you were not always a super communicator. I want to say that out front,
I,
because
I think my wife might have some evidence to the
she might,
contrary.
right. We need to get her on the phone, because when I first met you, and we went out to coffee in Brooklyn, and
Yeah.
you were just immediately one of these people who made great eye contact, was just delightful to talk to. And since then, you've grown a beard and you've moved to California and you're surfing and you seem only more, more delightful
Well,
to
thank
talk
you.
to.
That's very nice of you.
I have to think that, at least from the outside, it would appear that you have always been a super communicator. But I guess, yeah, go ahead.
One of the things you say that's really interesting is what we know. We tend to make the same assumption you just made, that we think about super communicators and we think that they're high energy and charismatic and extroverts. But it turns out that actually that's not really true. We all have the capacity to be super communicators, and we all at moments are super communicators. Yes. It's just that some of us can do it more deliberately. Some of us can do it more consistently. And it does not matter if you are high energy or low energy, if you are extrovert or introvert. Because it's a set of skills that we can learn, anyone can learn them.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, we may be better, it strikes me, at communication when we're in social environments than we are in business environments, right? In the sense that, that actually we have these instincts. I mean, you were referring earlier to this problem when you come home from work and talking with your wife about you're in a mode where you have a desire for an emotional conversation and she wants to give you practical advice, or vice versa.
Or vice versa,
right?
yeah.
Right. And I wonder whether it seems that knowing the difference between these different types of conversations, and I think you identify three main types of conversations, is absolutely critical to navigating, to connecting with each other.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And you're right. One of the big insights is that every discussion we have is made up of different kinds of conversations, and that we're using different parts of our brains during these different kinds of conversations, which is why it's either easier or harder for us to entrain. Because if you are having an emotional conversation and I'm having a practical conversation, you're using sort of the amygdala, the deep interior of the brain, and I'm using the prefrontal cortex. And so it's hard. We're literally speaking different cognitive languages. Yes. But in general, conversations fall into one of three buckets. There's these practical discussions, which are about how do we make plans? How do we solve problems together? What are we going to do next week? Where are we going to go on vacation? Then there's also emotional conversations. And those emotional conversations, I might describe how I'm feeling. I don't want you to solve my emotions, right? I want you to empathize. And then finally, there's social conversations, which are conversations about how we relate to each other and to society and the social identities that we carry around that are important to us. And what we found is that in general, as long as within that sort of those three big buckets, as long as you're having the same kind of conversation at the same moment, you'll become aligned with the person you're talking to. You will feel connected to them and they will feel connected to you. And at that point, you can move to other kinds of conversations, right? You might start with an emotional conversation and then move to a practical and then social and then back to emotional, but you'll be moving together. And that's what's really, really important.
Yes. Yeah. No, it's so helpful to highlight this, and because I think so much of our misconnections and our failed attempts to connect are when we're looking for different things from the same conversation.
No, absolutely.
We're in different modes. One practical application of connecting with other humans is recruiting spies.
That's exactly right.
I know we'd all like to get better at this, Charles. I certainly would like to get better at recruiting spies. Can you tell us the story of the lovably inept CIA agent Jim Lawler?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite stories from the book. So thank you for asking about it. Jim Lawler was an officer for the CIA, and he got hired when he was really young, like 31 years old. It was the early 80s. And he goes through training, and then they send him over to Europe. And his job is to go recruit spies, right? To convince people to give information to the CIA about their governments. And he is just terrible at this job. Like, he would go to parties, and he was so obvious what he was trying to do that people would say things like, "It's clear you're trying to recruit me. If you don't stop and leave right now, I'm going to report you to the authorities and you'll get deported." At one point, he tried to recruit this woman who worked at the Russian embassy. He spent months on this, and then one of his colleagues took him aside and he was like, "She's KGB. She's trying to recruit you. Like, this isn't working out." So
poor Jim. We're rooting for Jim here. We're rooting for Jim. Yeah.
So Jim eventually, things are not going well. He's only found one person that he will have conversations with him. It's this woman who's in town. She works for the foreign ministry of her home country in the Middle East. He takes her out to meals. They become friends. And then he says, I work for the CIA and we want the same thing you want, which is to help women in your country. Will you work for me? And she starts crying and saying, you're going to get me killed, and runs away. And so he goes and he tells his bosses, and his bosses are like, look, you're about to get fired. Like, this is not working out. You got one more chance. Bring someone in, or else and this was devastating for Lawler because he had spent his whole life wanting to work for the CIA. So he takes this woman, Yasmin, he takes her out to dinner one more time. And they're having a meal together, and she's really glum because she's about to head back to her home country. And so he's trying to make her feel better. He's trying to tell her little stories and jokes and cheer her up, and none of it's working. And at some point when the dessert comes, he just thinks to himself, I give up. This is not going to work. I cannot convince or manipulate someone into taking a suicidal risk. This is ridiculous. And so he just decides to be honest. And instead of trying to cheer her up, he says, look, I understand that you're disappointed in yourself before you go home, because I am so disappointed in myself. All I've ever wanted is this job, and now I lack this confidence or something to do it. And he just is honest with her and vulnerable.
Yeah.
And she starts to cry. And he feels terrible about this, in part because he didn't mean to make her cry, but also because in the CIA, when you have conversations like this, you have to write up the entire conversation for your bosses. So he's going to have to tell his bosses about the fact that he was honest with her, and then she cried. And so he reaches over to pat her on the arm and say, please don't cry. I'm really sorry. We can leave right now if you want. And she goes, no, I can hear what you're saying, and I think I can help you. We can do this together. And she becomes the best asset in the Middle East for the next 20 years. But the only reason it worked was because they were having the same kind of conversation. They were matching each other.
Yes, exactly.
And this is actually what's known as the matching principle in psychology, that says you have to have the same conversation at the same moment in order to connect with each other. And oftentimes that means being honest, being vulnerable, being authentic, and then responding to someone else's honesty and authenticity in the same way.
I just love that story, and it's and of course his assumption was, okay, she's concerned about her security. This is a potentially life-threatening job she's taking, right? This could be a suicidal mission, right? It's very, very dangerous to be an informant. How can I reassure her about her safety? But she was really in a different place mentally. And one possible interpretation here is that we are all so hungry for caring, trusting relationships that we're willing to die for them. Right. I mean that she was in essence, what changed was that she felt a level of trust and connection with him. Right. She didn't feel safer in terms of the inherent risks of taking this job. But she felt like I will be engaged in a nourishing relationship.
Yeah. And think about how often, I don't know that any of us have to take risks where we might die as a consequence to maintain relationships, but to think about the lengths we go to do that, right? You have a friend who's having a 50th birthday party across the nation, and you fly out there for a day and a half to help celebrate with them. Or you're in the middle of work and one of your kids calls, or your spouse calls, or someone who you feel really connected to, and you kind of drop everything to be able to answer that call. We all make sacrifices of one kind or another in order to maintain connections. And the reason why is because it feels so good. In fact, we know that this is actually what makes us happy, is having these connections. And again, that's a product of evolution, because eons ago on the plains, there were early Homo sapiens, and the ones who wanted to bond with other Homo sapiens, the ones who wanted it was proto-communication, but the ones who wanted to connect, they built families and then villages, and they survived longer. And that tendency, that desire to want to connect, that hunger to connect, that evolved within our brains until now. It explains so much of how the world works.
Yes. And that trust between two people was a life and death matter, right? I mean, we were relying upon each other to share food and protect each other, and consequently the stakes feel so high for 14-year-olds who are, included or excluded from a clique, and it feels like life and death, and that's for a reason, because it was at one time in our ancestry. It was life and death, right?
Yeah.
But this matching principle is so powerful once we see it, once we recognize it, and the visual in my head as I was reading your book is that we need to, if we want to connect with someone, we need to know where they are emotionally, mentally, and come to them and take them by the hand, right?
Yeah.
It's a sort of, and as part of that, the first step there is we need to figure out where people are, which modality are they in. How do we do that? How do we assess?
We do that by asking questions. So it might be helpful just to describe who supercommunicators are, right?
Great.
Because everyone knows one, and you are at times yourself. So if you were having a bad day and you wanted to call a friend who would just make you feel better, does the person you would call, do you know who that is?
Sure.
Yeah. Does it pop in your mind right away? So who is it for you?
It's quite a few people, but my brother comes to mind right away. Yeah.
So for you, your brother is a supercommunicator, and you're probably a supercommunicator back to him.
Yeah.
Now, as I mentioned, though, there are some people who can do this more consistently. There are some people who can connect with almost anyone, and it feels sort of effortless. And what we've discovered about them is that they have a couple of skills that they've learned, a couple of traits. One of which is that they tend to ask a lot of questions, 10 to 20 times as many questions as the average person.
Astonishing, right?
It's
10
huge
to 20 times as many questions. That's a lot of questions.
And the next time you're talking to your brother, pay attention to how many questions he asks. I'll bet you that it's actually a lot. And half of them you don't even notice, right? Because they're questions like, oh, what'd you do next? Or like, oh, what'd you say? Or what'd you think about that? These little throwaways that kind of invite us into the conversation. But then there's other questions that are really powerful because they're what's known as a deep question. And that sounds very daunting to say that you should ask deep questions. But it's actually very, very easy, because a deep question is simply something that asks someone to describe their values or their beliefs or their experiences. And it can be as simple as, bumping into someone and you learn they're a lawyer. A deep question might be, oh, what made you decide to go to law school? Or what's the best part of being a lawyer? What's the best case you've ever worked on? All three of those questions are deep questions. They're easy to ask, but they're deep questions because they invite someone to say something authentic and potentially vulnerable about themselves. And when they do, if we respond in kind, if we share something about ourselves, it is hardwired into our brains that we will feel closer to each other. We will feel more trusting of each other. And so the way that we figure out where someone's head is at, the way we figure out what kind of conversation they want to have, is we ask deep questions, and then we listen. We listen for not only what they say in response, but how they say it. Does it seem like this person is describing something emotional to me? Are they talking about feelings? Or are they just talking about like plans? They're going to Europe next summer and they want to tell me, they want to discuss like which trains are the best trains to take. It's pretty easy to hear once you start looking for it.
Yeah. And this distinction, it's I think we've all had this experience of like, coming home from a cocktail party or a social event of some kind and just thinking like, I talked to like a dozen people, but I really feel unsatisfied on some level. Like I didn't connect as well as I might have. And reading this section of your book, it became very, very clear to me why it is that we sometimes sort of fail to connect in this way. And it's because of this distinction, I think, between the shallow questions and deep questions, that if we ask questions the answer to which is a fact, right? Like, where did you go to college?
Right.
You end up with, having these exchanges. We've all had these exchanges, right? Where you have a series of, everybody can be diligent in asking each other questions. But if the answers to each of those first 6 questions are facts, everybody's kind of looking over their shoulders for the bathroom.
Yeah,
right?
You're exactly right.
You have this kind of unsatisfied sense that, okay, we're not really connecting. And you have this very useful set of examples of how we can reframe typical shallow questions for the deeper version of that same question.
Yeah.
Do you want? Could you share some examples? Yeah.
Yeah, of course. And part of it is just Instead of asking someone about the facts of their life, ask
Yes.
them how they feel about their life, what they make of something.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
instead of saying, where do you live? That's a dead end question. And it's fine to ask, do we live near each other? Where do you live? And they say Bernal Heights. Then the next great deep question is, oh, what do you like about it up there? Like, what's your favorite thing about your neighborhood? Now I'm suddenly telling you about like the importance of community to me. And I might mention that I have friends who are older and younger than I am. And I think that diversity is really, really interesting. Or I might tell you it's really, really expensive and I feel like I'm getting priced out. I'm learning so much about you as a person just by asking you how you feel about your neighborhood rather than what is your neighborhood? And it's very easy to do this once we start looking for the opportunities. And the truth of the matter is that we can actually do the same thing in some respects and just ask people what kind of conversation they want to have. Now when I come home from work and I'm having a bad day, my wife will often say to me, do you want me to help you like solve this problem, or do you just need to vent? You just want me to listen because you're frustrated.
Yeah.
And it feels like a deep question when she asks that, because I hadn't stopped usually to think for myself what the answer is, but I know exactly what it is. In schools, in particularly in New York and New Jersey, they teach teachers that when a student comes up with a question or a problem or just something that's real, that the teacher should start the conversation by asking them, do you want me to help you? Do you want me to hear you? Or do you want me to hug you?
Yeah, I love that.
And those, of course, are the three, the practical, the emotional, and the social conversations.
Yeah.
And so sometimes a deep question is simply asking someone, like, what do you want out of this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. You say, instead of what college did you attend, what was your favorite part of college?
Yeah.
Right. And these kinds of invitations can often sort of, cascade into sort of deeper and deeper sharing. And then this, as you point out, once people share something that's more personal and vulnerable, it can trigger an automatic primitive emotional contagion response, right? We have this, like, we're built, this is one of the wonderful takeaways from Supercommunicators, is that we're all built to connect, right? We're wired to connect with each other. And we just need to initiate the cycle of connection, and it kicks in.
That's exactly right. And that's really well put. And you're right. One of the things that happens is that when we ask a deep question and someone answers it in a way, and we use this word vulnerability, and it sounds like a big word and a big concept, but actually vulnerability just simply means I theoretically open myself to judgment, even though I might not care about what your judgment is, right? If you say, what was your favorite thing about vacation? And I say, oh man, we went skiing and I got a chance to hang out with my kids. There's a possibility that you might be like, skiing? Skiing's the worst, right? Like, you went skiing, you wanted to hang out with your kids. Couldn't you do that at home? Now, you're not going to say that. And if you did say it, I would be like, I don't care what you think about it. But the fact that I open myself up for the possibility of judgment, that feels vulnerable.
Yeah.
And when we hear that vulnerability, it's oftentimes the loudest form of communication. Again, we've evolved to pay really, really close attention to vulnerability, because in a state of nature, understanding who's vulnerable and who isn't is really important.
Yeah.
And there's nothing more natural than me asking you a deep question. What was your favorite thing about where you grew up? And then when you finish replying, even if you don't ask me back, it's very natural for me to answer the same question I asked you. Oh, that's what you loved about Kansas City? Actually, I grew up in Albuquerque, and I liked something kind of similar, but I think it was a little bit different. That's when you have this back and forth that's a real conversation, that's real connection.
Yeah. No, you say at one point, to get deep, we have to make an offering of our, I'm going to say this again. You say, to get deep, we have to make an offering of our vulnerability. And I love that sequence of words, an offering of our vulnerability, because it's a kind of personal sacrifice that we're making. It's an offer that we hope will be accepted and reciprocated, right? And
it's the offering rather than what happens next that feels really important. In the book, we tell the story of this guy, Nicholas Epley, who's a researcher at the University of Chicago. And he does a series of experiments, including he goes to a hedge fund and he tells everyone in the room, okay, in a couple of minutes, I'm going to tell you you're going to be paired up with a stranger, and you need to ask and answer this one question, which is, when's the last time you cried in front of another person? But before we do it, let me just ask you. Yeah, right. Let me ask you, like, are you looking forward to this conversation? And everyone's like, hell no. Like, I'm at a financial conference. I control $3 billion, and you want me to talk about when I've cried with a stranger?
Yeah.
But he tells, people, they go off, they do it. They're willing to sort of like, humor him. And then afterwards, he asks people, what was that conversation like? And they all say the same thing. They all say, this was one of the best conversations I've had in the last year.
Mm. Yeah.
And it's because when we offer up that vulnerability, it feels good. And when someone else says, I see you, I see what you're saying, I hear you, and I'm going to offer up something about myself that's equally intimate, then it feels wonderful.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's one of the great discoveries in life. And I actually it's towards the top of my list of things I would love to tell my younger self, is that taking that sharing your deepest vulnerabilities is a path to connection. And it's also a healing agent, right? It both now, and I've found myself, Charles, taking it a step further and just lobbing like vulnerability Molotov cocktails into early stage relationships. Maybe this is inadvisable, but I've found myself actually, as some regular listeners of this podcast know, I happen to love the social experiment that is the chairlift. I don't know if you ever go skiing, Charles.
Yeah.
But you get out of chairlift and you've got like 8.5 minutes with complete strangers.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's a great place to experiment. And
absolutely.
Right. And you can just open up with like, gosh, marriage is tough, or I feel stuck at work, or I've really screwed up as a dad.
You could say anything, right? You're never going to see them again.
Totally.
And even if you do, you're not going to recognize them because they're like encased in like this like bubble packaging for skiing.
That's true. But it's right. I didn't think about that. There's an anonymity to the ridiculous aspect.
Yeah.
But it's amazing how consistently, if you run that experiment, if you just offer some of the whatever is there are the deepest pains or challenges in your life, just out of the gate with a lightheartedness, it's very consistently reciprocated, and there's a connection.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely,
it's powerful.
In the book, one of the stories is about this thing called the Fast Friends procedure, which is also known.
Yes. Oh yes, I love this.
Yeah, and it's also known as the 36 questions that lead to love. And what happened is that these two researchers, they wanted to figure out if they could come up with a methodology to make strangers into friends in under an hour. So they experimented with all kinds of things, and the only thing that they found that worked was giving them a set of questions that they had to ask and answer back and forth, 36 of them in total. And each of them was a deep question. Some of them were like, when's the last time you cried in front of another person?
Right.
Others were like, if you could invite anyone to a dinner party, who would they be? Right. And that's easy to ask. That doesn't feel overly intimate. Now, what's interesting is that someone else ran the same experiment. And instead of having them ask and answer back and forth, they had one person do all 36 questions. And then their partner did all 36 questions in a row. Those people did not feel close. But if you went back and forth, so the way they did the experiment that was kind of fun is they brought people into a room, pairs 2 by 2. They'd have the conversation, and then they would leave, assuming that the experiment is over. And this is pre-internet, so it's not like they could just look each other up. The experimenters wouldn't give anyone else's information. It wasn't supposed to persist beyond this 1 hour they spent together. But then 7 weeks later, they poll everyone who participated, and 70% of the people had tracked down the person that they had those 36 questions with. Some people said, and again, pre-internet, right? Some people said, I knew his name was John and his last name started with S. And so I called everyone in the white pages who's John S until I found the right guy. One pair ended up getting married like a year later.
Right.
It just feels really good. We feel connected to people when we can be intimate with them or vulnerable or authentic.
Yes. No, and we all have these. It's occurred to me that that children may have been created by the cosmos in order to take people who think they have everything figured out and render them humble.
Yes.
Children make all of us humble. Like Charles, probably like before we had kids, we were just getting a little bit cocky and like, oh, we got this.
Yeah.
And then, the kids, bring us back into a state of humility. When they become teenagers, they do that even more intentionally, which is excellent. We were talking with Kim Scott about that last week. But children also take perfect relationships. Children also take perfect relationships and submit them to the twin stressors of limited time and limited money.
Yeah.
But all of this kind of humility is again fodder for. I mean, this delivers the vulnerability that we can share with each other to connect. And I've found in this last sort of decade of my life that you could that if I were to chart like the pace at which I've made new friends, I mean, of course, we all make a lot of friends in school when we're younger, and then we kind of often can stop making friends when we're heads down and work for a while. But I think it's correlated with vulnerability, right? In these periods of like high school is correlated with vulnerability for a lot of people. It was for me, and these periods of the vulnerability of being a parent, I think has for me had this wonderful silver lining.
And I think there's another important component of this, which is making time for these conversations. So one of the longest longitudinal studies we have is the Harvard study of adult development, right? And it's been going on for almost 100 years now, and they followed thousands of people around their whole lives trying to figure out what are the things that make you happier and healthier and more successful, however you define success, as you get older. And they had all these theories. Like it started in the before World War II. So some of the theories were a little crazy. Like if you came from a good family, you were definitely going to be happier, which turns out not to be true. But some of them were like, like looking at things like eating meat versus not eating meat, or, how much exercise you got. But the strongest thing that they found, the only thing that they found that at age 65 predicts if you're going to be healthier, happier, and more successful than your peers is having at least 2 close relationships, and probably more at age 45.
Yeah.
Right. So 20 years. And if you have 2 close relationships at age 45, you didn't start them that year, right? Those are probably people you've known for 15 or 20 years.
Yeah.
And what they discovered was that the thing that makes us not only happy, but the thing that makes us healthy, the thing that prolongs our life, the thing that allows us to see opportunities that we might otherwise miss, is having these real connections with other people. And the way that we create and maintain those connections is through conversations.
Yes.
Now, that doesn't mean you have to talk to them regularly. I have one friend whom I absolutely love, and I haven't seen him in 3 years, and we talk once every 6 months. But whenever we talk, it's so rejuvenating, right? It feels so, we connect immediately. And so I set aside, 2.5 hours on my calendar to have a conversation with him, because I know that this is important.
Yes.
And so I think in addition to being vulnerable, it's about saying, look, calling someone up who you haven't talked to in a year, and there's going to be a couple minutes of awkward conversation, right? That's actually a great use of time, because after the first few minutes, you're going to get right back into the groove with each other, and it's going to make you feel wonderful.
And yes, and if community is everything, if our relationships with other humans is everything, which I believe it is, that at the end it's not 50% of our happiness or 75 or 90% of our happiness. It's 100% really is our ability to connect with other people. That the conversations are these sort of atomic units out of which relationships are built, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's the conversation is so important, and the realization that, as you say, I mean, we're wired to connect, but being able to understand exactly how conversations succeed is so powerful, and realizing that this can be learned, which is really the message of the book. It's amazing.
Yeah. No.
But the One of the most revelatory stories in the book for me, Charles, and there are quite a few, is NASA's efforts to become more emotionally intelligent.
Yeah. Yeah.
Could you share that story?
Of course, of course. So, and this really gets to, when we talk about conversations, we often or communication, we often sort of think of verbal communication, or at least linguistic communication, right? It could be written, but it's words. And yet, one of the things we know is that about 50% of communication across different channels is non-linguistic. It's the noises we make, it's the gestures that we use, it's the emoji that we attach to an email, it's how we where we make the paragraph break. So is it just like one big block of text, or am I breaking it up for you? All those things matter a huge amount, not only in how we communicate, but in how we connect. And what's really interesting to me is the non-linguistic, the non-verbal aspects of this. And you're exactly right. So in the early 1980s, NASA decided that they needed to start hiring astronauts with more emotional intelligence. And the reason why is because Ronald Reagan had just said that he wanted to build a space station. And up until then, most NASA missions were like 7 to 10 days. But they were going to start sending people up for like 6 months or 12 months. And they realized like, these people are living in a tin can together, right? They need to be good at connecting with each other.
Yeah, right. It's new skills are required for this mission.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And now the problem for them though is that if you make it to the final rounds of astronaut application, you are like you're amazing, right?
Yeah, right.
In fact, you're so amazing that you can fake emotional intelligence really, really well.
Yeah.
And so this one psychologist, Terry McGuire, he had this basic problem, which is he said, look, I can't tell who's faking emotional intelligence in our interviews and who actually has it. And this is a problem because even if they might be able to fake it in an interview, what we find is 3 months into the mission, that's where the difference between faking it or actually having it matters a lot. So he starts looking for a new way to interview people, to try and figure out who actually is really good at connecting with other people. And he's listening to old recordings of interviews, and he notices something kind of interesting. The candidates that they ended up selecting as astronauts, who went on to have like fantastic careers and were beloved by everyone, they laughed differently than everyone else.
Right.
So he comes up with this new experiment. Now, I should explain, one of the things that we know about laughter is most of the time when we laugh, it is not in response to something funny, right? About 80% of the times when we laugh, there has been no attempt at humor preceding that laugh, right? We're laughing right now.
This
and there's
is so interesting.
I didn't tell a joke.
Right.
Well,
right.
the reason we laugh in conversations is to show the other person that we want to connect with them. And when they laugh back, they're showing us that they want to connect as well.
Yes.
So McGuire's comes up with this new form of doing an interview. What he starts doing is he'll go into the interview room, the candidate's sitting there, and he'll be carrying a stack of papers. And as he comes through the door, he'll spill them as if on accident. And then he would laugh, this big boisterous laugh, like, I am such a klutz, I can't believe I did that. And notice really carefully how the candidate laughed back.
Yeah.
Everybody would laugh back because it's basic social politeness. If someone's laughing, you should laugh back. But some of them would just go like a little chuckle and say like, that's funny. Yeah. And then some of them would match him and they would laugh as big as he did. And what he found is that those people who laughed as big as he did, the ones who wanted to connect with him, who wanted to prove to him, show him that they wanted to connect, those were the ones with emotional intelligence. And and then later in the interview, oftentimes he would talk about a family member who had passed away, and what was very natural was for some people to say, oh, my condolences, I'm really sorry.
Yeah.
But other people would say, oh, I'm so sorry. What was that like for you? Like, do you still think about your sister? Because I have a friend who passed away like 10 years ago, and I still have dreams about him.
Yeah.
Those are people who had high emotional intelligence. Those are people who were showing that they wanted to connect. And so I mentioned one thing that consistent supercommunicators do is they ask deep questions. They also prove that they're listening to you. But really powerfully, they also show you that they want to connect. Because oftentimes, until someone shows us, we don't know if they do. And when they do, it's like an invitation to be ourselves.
So interesting. Yeah, this idea that laughter is really is really largely a social signal,
Oh
right?
yeah.
Indicating a kind of engagement and a desire to connect, maybe to play. I almost think of it as like I almost think of it as like a play signal, like a dog crouching and
Yeah.
wagging its tail. It's a desire to connect. And in these studies, you say, you know, less than 20% of laughter is in response to, quote, anything resembling a formal expression of humor, anything resembling. People laugh in response to statements like, it was nice to meet you too.
Yeah.
Does anyone have a rubber band? Right.
And that's
And
actually from the study. Those were
yeah,
literally things that they
right.
collected in the study that people laughed in
Totally.
response to.
Right. And
And
yeah.
as a little diversion, it's actually kind of interesting to talk about where laughter came from. So
Okay.
no one's really
Yeah.
certain, but the contemporary theory right now is that there's a noise that simians like apes and chimpanzees make that when there's a predator in the area, all the apes will take to the trees, and there's a noise that they make that means be careful. There's danger here. When the predator leaves, there's a sound that they'll make where they're barking, and that barking sound is the signal that it's okay to come out of the trees now. And what's interesting is that barking sound sounds like laughter. And so the theory is that we came to associate this particular kind of noise that we can make with relief and with a sense of lightness and with a sense of, like not having to worry anymore. And that actually became laughter as Homo sapiens became more and more evolved.
That is so interesting. I've
Isn't
never
it?
heard that.
Yeah.
Wow. I love that. I love that. Yeah. Darwin had this wonderful theory that we were singing apes, and that we spoke to each other without words that had meaning, but just with prosody, with these kinds of lilts of our voices to communicate emotion, for countless hundreds of thousands of years before actually developing specific words and language, which is fascinating.
I think that's definitely true.
Yeah.
Well, and what's interesting, I mentioned that, so our brains become entrained when we're communicating, if we're actually connecting with each other.
Yes.
And what's really interesting about this is that when you look at how those noises, right? The noises of comfort we make, or the non-linguistic forms of communication, what Darwin was talking about. What we find is that other animals cannot do neural entrainment. So when I say that communication is Homo sapiens' superpower, it's actually very, very true. That we can do this thing that no other species can do, which is that simply through making voices with our mouth or with gestures when we're communicating, we can entrain with each other. And other animals can't do that. I might listen, if I'm a bird, I might listen to another bird and I might recognize a warning, but I can't feel the same thing that bird is feeling if it's capable of feelings, right? We know that its neural activity doesn't begin to match up. But if I tell you a sad story and I'm feeling sad, you start to feel sad as well because your brain is becoming more similar to mine. And that's basically unique to our species. And as far as we can tell, at such a profound and sophisticated way. And that is the superpower we have that has allowed us to succeed.
It's so cool. And you're right. When we click with someone, our eyes start to dilate in tandem, our pulses match, we feel the same emotions and start to complete one another's sentences in our heads. This is called neural entrainment, and it feels wonderful.
Yeah.
So it's like we're wired for this, and it's about not only, you were speaking earlier about matching. So we're matching not only the mood and the content, but then there's this sort of much more subtle level of matching all these, like the valence, the nuances of the mood and energy.
Absolutely.
That's a dance, right? That's part of a kind of dance that we do.
And I think sometimes when people hear that, they become worried because it sounds like this might be like instructions for manipulation, right?
Right. Sure.
But an important distinction to make here is that there's a real difference between mimicry and matching. So
Yeah.
mimicry
Yeah.
is something that, like, con artists use. And
Yes.
and what they'll do is they see you having certain gestures and they'll have the same gesture. So they'll see you're interested in something and they'll feign interest in that. When you're actually matching someone, on the surface, it can look very similar, because one of the things we know is that if you're in a conversation with someone and you start using gestures, like big gestures, they'll start using big gestures too, right?
Yeah.
We tend to physically imitate each other a little bit. But the difference between mimicry and matching is that in mimicry, it's inauthentic, or it's transactional. And we as humans have this like fine-tuned thing within our head to detect inauthenticity, which makes sense, because in a state of nature, if you're trying to decide who to trust, you're going to be on guard for someone who does something that makes you think he wants to con me. He wants me to trust him. In fact, one of my favorite experiments is that some researchers collected tapes of friends laughing together, like genuine laughter. And then also strangers laughing together, where they were basically just trying to imitate each other. And then they would cut them down and they would play just 1-second clips of the tapes for listeners. And listeners with 90% accuracy could tell the friends and the strangers apart. Because we are really good at picking up on inauthenticity. So when someone tries to mimic us, when they tell us a story that's sort of similar to the story we just told, but they're not being authentic, it's not real, it's not something that they're really feeling, they're just trying to manipulate us, we can detect that. And we've all been in conversations like that, right? Somebody asks you, oh, where'd you go on vacation? Because what they really want to tell you is where they went on vacation. They're waiting their turn to speak. We notice that. We know what's going on. And so the key here is not to just mimic people. The key here is to really listen to what they're saying. Ask yourself, is this, are they telling me about emotions? Are they telling me about how they relate to other people? Or are they telling me something kind of practical, like where they're going on vacation? And then match them and invite them to match you.
Yes. Yeah. Here's a quote from your book that I love. Every meaningful conversation is made up of countless small choices. There are fleeting moments when the right question or a vulnerable admission or a kind of word can completely change a dialogue. A silent laugh, a barely audible sigh, a friendly smile during a tense moment. So it does feel like a dance. It's not just mimicry, right? It's this dance. Although when you talk about fraudulence, here's something that gives me pause, Charles. AI is going to be really good at this, right? And in fact, it already is. Don't you think?
Well, so it's interesting. There's actually been some recent papers looking at this, and so AI can be good at this if we want it to be good at it and if we invite it in. So one of the experiments that was done was trying to teach people basic communication skills by having them converse with AI. And they found that people could in fact improve, like learn these skills that we know supercommunicators have by interacting with an AI system, because the AI system would kind of model it for them. And they could pick up and use those cues. Now, in situations where people have been presented with things and they don't know if it's a real person or if it's AI, the Turing test situation. What they find is that if it's very practical, then sometimes you can get you can pass the Turing test. Sometimes you can confuse people whether it's AI. But as soon as you start getting into a deeper conversation, a really meaningful conversation, people know immediately whether it's a person or AI.
Interesting.
Right? Yeah. Because if you think about it, like if I ask you, how are things with your marriage? And I tell you a story about me and my wife, there's such a subtle nuance in how you're going to reply. And if if there is no nuance there, I'm going to pick up on it. I'm going to think to myself, like, either this person isn't listening to me, or they don't really care what I'm talking about, or they're a chatbot who's been programmed, right? We've all had that experience where we like telephone some customer service place, or we go online and we think it's a real person, and then we know they tell us it's a real person, and then we know immediately that it's a chatbot because it's just not quite right. And people feel like, oh, maybe if the AI systems get better, if the large language models get bigger. But I think it's different. I think that the dividing line there is not how much data and compute we can throw into the model. It's that there is something about authenticity that makes the conversation work.
Meanwhile, you tell a story of a company that sells software that helps customer service agents modulate tone, right?
Yeah.
Right, because the idea is that one finds, obviously with customer service agents, it's very important that they're able to connect with a frustrated customer. And in order to do that, this matching quality is very important, right? To match the speed, the tone, the mood.
Absolutely.
And this software gives instructions. You're talking too slowly or too quickly, or you
put more
need to make
energy into your
adjustments.
voice, or yeah.
Okay.
And it's interesting. So let's say you call up, and I'll give everyone the hint on how to beat the system.
Interesting. Okay.
Use a curse word as early as you can in the conversation, and you will definitely get sent to someone who's very competent to solve your problem. So the systems are all built to like notice curse words, because they figure if someone uses a curse word, they're really upset.
Okay.
But beyond that, if you call and you're angry, let's say, you don't want a representative who's angry back at you, right? Right. But if you're angry and you're high energy and you call and the call representative is really calm and they're like, "Sir, thank you for bringing your problem to me today. I want to help you." And you're like, "You got to do something. You're driving me crazy." You're going to be so frustrated. So it's not that you necessarily have to match someone's emotion one for one, but you do have to match their affect, their energy, what they're bringing to it. And in fact, this is the same thing that ended up making the sitcom The Big Bang Theory into a big hit.
Right.
When they first wrote that sitcom, it was a huge flop. Like nobody liked the show. And the problem for the writers was that anyone who's never seen the show, it's about these physicists who are really awkward, and they're really bad at conversation. They're really bad at expressing what they feel or like having any nuanced conversations. That's where the humor comes from. But the problem for the writers is, how do you write a show where the audience knows what's going on if your main characters are really bad at describing what they're thinking and feeling and what they're doing? And the answer was, they just told the actors, it doesn't matter what you say. Match each other's energy and affect, the intensity you bring to this and the mood that you're showing. If you do that, then the audience will know whether you're connected with that other person or not. Which is even if I say, "I hate you," and you say, "I hate you" back, we know that you're actually in love because you're saying it the same way.
So interesting. Yeah. Well, it does strike me that bringing it back to the artificial intelligence question, that though AI may not be there yet, it's going to continue to get better, and we need to understand human behavior as well as artificial intelligence and companies empowered by AI who want to sell us things do. Right. So I mean, it's like this science of human psychology and human communication and human connection. It's in our interest to figure it out. And AI is already a partner in that process, right? Analyzing communication and giving us feedback. And it seems like a moment in history where we want to understand ourselves and how we connect really well, in part to be able to protect against possible manipulation.
Yeah, and we have kind of forgotten that, right? Like our brains are these evolved tools for communication, but they evolved in a very different time. They evolved before telephones, and they definitely evolved before the internet. And we used to teach communication in schools. Like it used to be part of the curriculum. Right.
Yeah.
And as schools became more technical and there were more demands placed on students, it sort of dropped out. But the thing that we know is it's just a set of skills. It's actually a simple set of skills that anyone can learn. And because our brain is programmed for this, you want to get that?
Yeah, sorry. That's
okay.
That is my mother-in-law's phone, actually. Here we go. Okay, we're good. We're clear.
Okay.
Yeah, if you could pick that back up,
sure.
You know where you were. Yeah, great.
Because our brain has evolved for this. It's good at communication. Once we get exposed to those skills, we tend to make them into habits very, very quickly. So this, for instance, looking for deep questions to ask or proving to someone that you're listening, and we can talk about how you do that, the skill behind it. Once you start looking for deep questions, you'll find them almost immediately. Like it's not hard to do because our brain just needs a little bit of guidance. That's why I wrote Supercommunicators, is because it lists the skills that if you hear them and you understand them, you very much automatically start doing them because that's what makes us good at communication.
I love this notion that we have we have this intelligence built into us, right? And it's this kind of latent asset. And with a little more instruction on how to trigger our better sort of communication instincts, we can kind of get outsized connection, outsized results.
Yeah.
Now, the last portion of your book, Charles, is really about having hard conversations as a nation, I think, and
Yeah.
how we can do it better, which is so important, a problem so many of us feel today. And I really like your observation that we've been having very difficult, nearly impossible conversations as a nation for a very long time.
Since the beginning of the nation, right?
Since the very beginning. Like, this is not a new thing. It feels new, not new.
No,
Right.
no, that's why.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you think about what the Constitutional Convention was,
Right.
it was
Yeah.
a group of men who hated each other, that despised each other.
Right.
And all they did was argue for like 3 weeks straight.
Yeah.
But they were able to argue and produce a constitution.
Yes.
Our strength is that we can do this.
Yes,
We just have to be reminded how.
They weren't arguing on Facebook, however. They were arguing.
That's true. That's true. That's
in
true.
a room, right? Yeah.
So what's interesting? So in the book, we tell the story of this experiment that was done involving guns. Where
Oh yes, I love
and this gets to the value of proving that we're listening and how important that is in a conversation. And what these experimenters did is they brought together a large group of people who were gun rights advocates, like the types of people who like lobby and march and protest and own 20 to 40 guns themselves. And then they brought in an equal number of gun control activists, including people whose children had been killed at school shootings. And these groups, they weren't strangers to each other, but usually when they saw each other, they were screaming at each other, right? They were on opposite sides of a protest line. And they brought them together and they said, look, our goal is not for you to convince each other of anything or even agree on anything. We just want to see if it's possible to have a civil conversation. But before you guys start talking to each other, we want to teach you some basic skills. And one of the skills was a version of something called looping for understanding. And the goal of looping for understanding is proving to you that I am listening to you. Because particularly in a conflict, particularly when we disagree with each other, there's something in the back of your brain that is suspicious that I'm not listening. I'm just waiting my turn to speak. So the way that we prove that we're listening is what we do after someone stops talking. And this is what looping for understanding is. It has 3 steps. Ask a question, preferably a deep question. Step 2, repeat back in your own words what you hear the person says. Again, not mimicry, but showing them that you've internalized what they're saying. You understand. And step 3, and this is the one we always forget, ask if you got it right. Now, sometimes we can do this in a conversation with just a follow-up question, right? Like, it's interesting you mentioned that, Rufus. Like, I'm wondering, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong. Like, what do you think should happen? Fill in the blank. It doesn't have to be something where it's formal and it's hard. But when we prove that we're listening to each other, what happens is it triggers all of these instincts within our brain that we believe you are listening to me. And so as a result, I want to listen to you. And that's exactly what happened with the gun folks, is that they found nobody changed each other's mind. Nobody found things that they agree on regarding guns. But people walked away from this saying, it felt so amazing to hear this person who I thought was an enemy listen to me and really want to and then once they did, like, I wanted to understand them. And even though I don't agree with them, like, I see all the other things that we have in common, right? I see that we're both parents, that we both care about our kids. I understand why guns are important to you, even though they're not important to me. It's that understanding that creates connection. And we don't have to agree with each other to have that. We just have to listen.
Yeah. No, I love this idea that step 1 for us to kind of heal these divides may be simply to lower our expectations, right? I mean, let's try to disagree better, right?
Yeah.
Let's try to understand each other. And even if we think there's a very low probability we're going to change each other's minds, this process of understanding where the other person is or the other side is coming from and not turning them into caricatures, with these awful motives is really a really powerful first step. And
it gets to what the real goal of a conversation is, right? The goal of a conversation is not to convince someone of someone. It's not to simply share what you think or what you believe. It's not even necessarily to find something you have in common. The goal of a conversation is a success if I understand you and you understand me. Even if we walk away thinking that guy is completely wrong, if I understand why you think the things that you think, and I've somehow talked to you in a way that you understand me a little bit better, then that conversation has been a success. Because we've become a little entrained, right? We've begun thinking the same way. And inevitably, when we do that, we're going to find that there are some ways of looking at the world that we have in common. And that's the fodder for us to build a relationship.
Now, unfortunately, there's a somewhat bittersweet ending to the story of the relationship between the gun rights advocates and the gun control activists, which is that, right, they're very effective at getting together in Washington, D.C. and really understanding each other much better, even if they don't change each other's minds. Some friendships develop, right? It's a great experiment. But then they go back, they get on Facebook, and
they start calling each other jackbooted Nazis within 45 minutes. Yeah, it all falls apart, right? Right. They like, it all falls apart when they go online.
Yeah.
And so there's this big question, and the moderators are able to, and the experimenters are able to recover it a little bit, but there's this big question: why? Like, what is it about online dialogue that makes it appear so much harder? And what research tells us is this: about 100 years ago, when phones first became popular, there were all these studies that appeared that said no one will ever be able to have a real conversation on a telephone, because if you can't see each other, you can't really communicate. And what's interesting is that when those studies were written, they were right. If you look at transcripts of early phone conversations, they're weird and they're stilted. People basically treated them like telegraphs. They would send like shopping lists or stock orders. And so, but by the time you and I and everyone listening was in high school, we could talk on the phone for like 7 hours a night, right? And it was the most intimate conversations of our life. Right, so what happened? How did humans learn to talk on the phone? Well, one of the things that we know is that people learned that there are a set of rules, even without realizing that they've learned this. People learned that there's a set of rules for the phone. So when we were talking on the phone, without noticing it, you tend to overemphasize your words. You put more emotion in your voice because you know the person can't see you. There are slightly different rules that are we follow almost unconsciously on the phone versus face-to-face. Now, we've been talking on the phone for 100 years, right? We've been online for like 20 years, and some form, like, I started slacking for the first time like 5 years ago, and my kids use emojis that I don't even understand. There are the thing that we have to remind ourselves is there are different rules for different forms of communication. And when we assume that the rules are the same, that's when we make a mistake. That's when all of a sudden we get angry, right? The people who went on that Facebook to talk about guns, they assumed talking on Facebook would be like talking face to face. But of course it isn't, right? When you're on Facebook, you can't be sarcastic because usually you hear the sarcasm in someone's voice, but when you read it, you don't hear that sarcasm. You think they're being serious.
Yes.
We know that when you're online, being much more polite, literally just saying please and thank you, cuts down the incidence of conflict by over 50%. And using emojis or images or explaining emotions. Like when you think about what an emoji is, it's actually me expressing an emotion to complement what I just typed. Most of them. Some of them mean other things, right? The smiley face means that, or the crying face.
Yeah.
And so what we found is that if people just take a second, like literally a second before they hit send or before they write that email, and just remind themselves, okay, I'm sending an email, and an email is a little bit different from a text, and it's definitely different from calling someone, then the communication online gets so much better.
Yeah, we have not yet developed the cultural norms, or we're in the process of developing the kind of cultural norms that make us effective, make it possible for us to be effective at connecting, communicating effectively through text, chat, and so on online. We're not there yet, but we can get better at this. This is a hopeful message.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
No, absolutely. And our kids are already better at it than we are, right? And you're exactly right. It is a hopeful message because oftentimes all we need to do is just realize that there's different rules, right? If I asked you, like, can you, if you have bad news to give someone and you could choose whether to do it face to face or over the phone, You'd be like, oh, face to face, right? Unless you're a conflict avoidant, in which case you'd be like, over the phone. Like,
Yeah.
like we know that there's different rules there. We just have to think
Yeah.
about the different rules that exist with all these new technologies.
Yeah. Well, Charles, I'm interested to know to what extent the principles that you describe in Supercommunicators apply to how you write books.
Hmm.
You've sold more than 5 million copies of your books. And
Yeah, in the U.S. Yeah,
in the U.S., okay,
yeah.
we
No, it's over
well,
10 globally,
wow,
which is great.
wow,
Yeah, no, I feel
astonishing,
enormously fortunate.
right? Astonishing. And at the Next Big Idea Club, we've had the great privilege of, working with lots of writers who've sold, collectively, many tens of millions of books. And there are commonalities we see in these books that are most effective, much as there are commonalities that we see in Supercommunicators, right? Um, and I think we see some of the same patterns in the top TED Talks, right? You'll often have like a humbling personal experience. I'm just sorry. I'm going to have a sip of
Sure.
water. I hear Caleb in the back of my head. You'll often have a humbling personal experience. I was a lousy manager at the New York Times, or not good at communicating with my wife. That motivated me to go out, look into the science. I figured out how to help myself, and now help you apply science to be better at your life. Or sometimes, this is done through storytelling, right? Here's
Yeah.
a story of someone who suffered a very humbling personal experience. There's the vulnerability, right? And this motivated them to figure some things out or come to some realizations. And so I wonder whether do you see some of these patterns that this notion of
Oh,
like
yeah.
we need to connect emotionally first to some degree, right? And then practical solutions come next.
I think that in a lot of situations that makes sense. Now, I should say that that's not always true, right? Like
Yeah.
if we're discussing where we want to go for vacation, and we're choosing between Paris and London, we might not need to have an emotional conversation. we
Right,
might just be ready to talk about practicalities. But
Yeah.
in general, you're right that
Although in that case, I'm sorry to interrupt, Charles, but in that case, you're talking about two people who already trust each other.
Yeah.
If I'm talking to a stranger on the subway about going to Paris,
yeah,
we probably need to establish
at the very
trust
least
first,
you
right?
want to like learn a little bit about them, right?
Yeah,
To find out
yeah.
if maybe they hate French food. But
Yeah.
But in general, you're right that one of the things that we know is that these three kinds of conversations, they happen in every discussion, right? There's always an element of the emotional, there's always an element of the practical and the social. And of the three of them, we tend to ignore the emotional conversation the most. But it's actually the most important one.
Right.
Because it undergirds so much of what we talk about, particularly if we're having a hard conversation, if we have to give someone bad news and we're anxious about it, if we're conflict avoidant and we have to bring up something that we think they're not going to like. Emotions influence every conversation that we have. But particularly in America, we've fallen into the habit of pretending that they don't. And it's so easy to engage on that level. One of my favorite examples is, if you're at work and before a meeting starts, you're kind of you're chatting with, your work colleagues, and you say, "Oh, what'd you do this weekend?" And one of them says, "Oh, I went to my kid's graduation and it was fantastic." It'd be so easy just to say like, "Oh, congratulations. That's wonderful. Okay, let's get down to business. Here's the agenda." But if you take 2 minutes and you say, "Oh, wow, congratulations. That sounds amazing."
Yeah.
What did it feel like to watch your kid walk across that stage? Like, was it just amazing, or were you sad, and if you ask that question, that person feels, they're obviously thinking about this, right? They brought it up. It's something that's on their mind. They want to talk about it. And when we provide an opportunity for them to do so, and then we reciprocate, they say, "Oh, it felt amazing. Like, I'm so proud of my son." And then we say, "Oh, my kids are younger. They're not at college yet. And like, I'm so proud of them too, but I'm also a little sad they're getting older." Like I think about that graduation as like, that takes what, 2 or 3 minutes? But now we have a connection with that person. Like, we actually feel connected to that person, and they feel connected to us. And then when we start talking about the agenda, it makes it so much easier.
Yeah. And do you think, though, I don't know if it was like Malcolm Gladwell who was the first, or where it came from, but this but this magic of combining storytelling and emotional connection with science that can be applied to our lives and that can help us change our lives. That combination is powerful in book writing, and I'm wondering if do you see a connection?
It goes back. I mean, so there was.
It must go back even further.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, the Bible is a bunch of stories, right? With sort of emotional lessons, like they're preaching at you. But even, if you just even go back and you look at Charles Dickens, a lot of what Charles Dickens wrote was his goal to tell people what the sort of proto-social science of the time told us about how humans develop. And so he did it all through these stories, and the stories were very, very emotional. That's why people love them so much. There's a guy named John Brooks, and it's who he wrote a column for the New Yorker magazine in the 50s and 60s called Adventures in Capitalism. And he would tell the story of what happened in the market, or he would tell the story of a company, hoping to teach you a lesson, right? Hoping to reveal something that we've discovered is true about how markets work. And so this mirroring of science and stories, it's as old as we are. And you're right, it's powerful because if nothing else, it just makes it more entertaining, right? It's more engaging. The reason I fill my books with stories is because if I tell you an idea, you'll think it's interesting and then you'll forget it. But if I tell you that idea through a story, that story will lodge in your brain.
Yes.
And you'll begin to act on it.
Absolutely. I think some of the ideas in the book also very much apply to podcasts, right? And I think of, I'm kind of fascinated by, as I know you are, the evolution of media and, the way that we communicate ideas. And when you think of the early days of podcasting, you had sort of the classic NPR style interview, right? Which was a very tight series of questions. Terry Gross, amazing, right? Very good at very efficiently conducting an interview that triggers, really, really interesting responses. But that's somewhat different from a conversation, right? It's an interview opposed to conversation. And I think the podcasting genre has evolved more in the direction of conversations, which require more time because we need time to match each other, right? To mirror each other's emotions, or to share stories, to share in a way that's more symmetrical. And it seems to be powerful. It seems to be something that people connect with.
No, I agree. And I think that having a relationship with that host, for this audiobook, for my two previous books, I didn't record the audiobook, and this one I did.
Oh, great. Yeah.
And to be honest, neither I nor any other author on the face of this planet is as good at recording an audiobook as a professional voice actor. But people prefer the author to read it because there is this relationship, right? There is this intimacy that you're building with someone. And I think the same thing is true in podcasts.
Yes. No, it's so powerful. In some sense, I think we've come full circle when you think of the Socratic dialogue. That the history of ideas and philosophy began in dialogue.
Yeah.
And then because of the technology of the book, we sort of gave way to the protracted monologue that is the book, which of course I think is important and powerfully additive, clearly, to the world of ideas. Thank goodness for books, but it kind of coming back to dialogue to some degree.
I actually think that books, in some respects, if a book is well written, the author is anticipating what the reader is saying. They're getting to the point. They're they're going to be skeptical. I need to prove to them this is true. They're going to be sad here. So I need to acknowledge that. I don't think books aren't such a departure from dialogues if they're well done, right? A politician speaking in front of a crowd is oftentimes proving that they're listening, right? The things that they say might be boring, they might be policy, but they say things like, I know you're really angry. I hear that you're angry, and I'm angry too. We need to take this country back. That's an act of proving that you're listening. Now, it can be used as we know, in very negative ways, or it can be Barack Obama saying, I hear you saying that you're hopeful, and I'm gonna prove to you that I'm listening to you by saying, yes, we can, that we are about hope. Dialogues aren't just two people speaking to each other. Dialogues fill our lives in so many different ways.
Yeah. Right. And a book is also a conversation with all the books that preceded it.
That's absolutely right.
It's a conversation with all the researchers that you interviewed that comes to life in the pages, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of the art of conversation that comes to fruition there. And is this, Charles, why you got into journalism, into the business of writing books? Has it always been a desire to communicate, to connect?
Yeah. So I went to I decided to become a journalist. I worked for my college newspaper, and then I went back to my home of Albuquerque, and I started a company there, and realized I had no idea what to do in business. So once the company was kind of stabilized, I went to business school, and we ended up selling the company midway through business school. So I suddenly had, sort of some freedom, and I was trying to decide whether to go back to New Mexico and go into business and go into politics, or whether to become a journalist. And what it ultimately came down to for me was that I wanted to find something that would just fascinate me for, the rest of my life.
Yeah.
And the thing about politics is really fascinating, but if you lose, it gets boring. Like, there's long periods of boredom in politics.
It's more interesting when you win. Yeah.
It's way more interesting. But even if you win, there's long periods of boredom, right? Like,
yeah.
Whereas trying to figure out how stories work, trying to figure out why some stories are so powerful and others aren't, and why some stories spread, it just felt like that could interest me for the rest of my life.
Mm-hmm.
And so I decided to become a journalist. And in large part, I write the books that I write, and that's very different from the work I do for the New Yorker or previously the New York Times, because I do believe that, first of all, science is learning things that can improve our lives. But second of all, that we're surrounded by these systems that we're not really aware of, right? The rules of conversation, the people who know the rules of conversation, they do better in life. But it's not like anyone ever sits down and says, hey, by the way, there's some rules you should know, right? Capitalism, I'm a avowed capitalist. I went to Harvard Business School. But capitalism is a system that has pluses and minuses, costs and benefits that oftentimes we don't even talk about. And so when we can illustrate the systems that exist and point out that there are alternatives, or that learning about this system makes you better at it, that's when I think we really empower people to literally live their best lives.
Yeah. Amazing. And so this book will certainly do that, Charles. It will certainly help a lot of people communicate better, and hopefully will also help us collectively disagree better.
Yeah.
And get to know each other in the process.
A little bit better. It would be a nice it'd be a nice world when we sit, and the truth of the matter is, like, nobody wants to fight with their neighbor. It doesn't matter what politician's lawn sign. Like, you don't want to wake up and, like, you want to get along with that guy and or that woman, and the fact that, like, they're going to vote for someone different is probably the smallest difference between the two of you.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Charles, for being with us today. It was wonderful engaging in neural entrainment with you. That felt wonderful.
Well, thanks for having me on. I really, really appreciate it.